The wind carved through the canyon like a blade through bone, carrying with it the scent of snow and something deeper, the metallic tang of winter's first promise. Against the darkening sky, 5 riders moved as shadows, their horses' breath forming clouds that dissipated into the gathering dusk. They were men shaped by violence and hardened by necessity, each carrying the weight of choices that had led them far from whatever homes they might have once known. Samuel Crow rode at the front, his weathered face a map of scars and unspoken regrets. The others followed in loose formation, Dutch, whose hands had forgotten how to be gentle, Martinez, who spoke in whispers when he spoke at all, young Billy, still soft around the edges, despite the iron he carried, and Thomas, whose eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much and saved too little. They were bound not by friendship, but by shared exile, united in their separation from a world that had no place for their kind. The storm had been building for days, pressing down on the high country with the weight of winter's judgment. They had been riding hard, putting distance between themselves and the railroad money that now weighed heavy in their saddlebags. The job had gone clean, no shots fired, no blood spilled, but the law would come nonetheless. It always did. They needed shelter, needed to wait out the storm, and the inevitable pursuit that would follow. It was Martinez who spotted the cabin first, a dark smudge against the white-dusted hillside. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray line, speaking of warmth and shelter in the presence of others. The men exchanged glances, their faces set in the careful neutrality of those who had learned to read danger in every shadow. They had taken what they needed before, would take it again if necessary. Survival had taught them that conscience was a luxury they could not afford. Samuel raised his hand, and the group drew to a halt. The cabin sat alone in the clearing, its windows glowing amber against the approaching darkness. A single horse stood in the lean-to beside the structure, its coat thick with winter hair. There were no other signs of life, no indication of how many souls might be sheltering within those walls. "Storm's coming hard," Dutch said, his voice carrying the weight of observation and warning both. The wind had picked up, driving snow in horizontal sheets that stung their faces and set their horses to dancing nervously beneath them. "We need that shelter." Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving the cabin. He had learned to read the signs to measure the distance between survival and damnation. The storm would kill them if they remained in the open. The cabin offered sanctuary, regardless of who might already claim it as their own. In his calculations, the lives of 5 outlaws weighed heavier than the comfort of strangers. They approached at a walk, their weapons loose in their holsters, their eyes scanning the windows for movement. The snow fell harder now, each flake a small judgment against their faces. The world had taken on the hushed quality that comes before true winter, when the wind dies and the snow falls straight down like a curtain being drawn across the stage of the world. At the cabin door, Samuel dismounted and knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the growing silence. From within came the sound of movement, cautious and deliberate. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman whose face carried the particular pallor of advanced pregnancy. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, framing features that might have been beautiful were they not drawn tight with pain and exhaustion. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither side was certain they wanted to cross. Samuel found himself looking into eyes that held a depth of suffering he recognized, the particular anguish of someone who had been abandoned by the world and left to face their fate alone. Behind her, the cabin's interior glowed with warmth, but something in her posture spoke of a chill that ran deeper than winter. "Storm's coming," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of explanation and request both. "We need shelter." She stepped back, her hand pressed to her swollen belly, and nodded. "There's room," she said, "but I think my time is coming." The men filed into the cabin, their spurs ringing against the wooden floor, their presence filling the small space with the scent of leather and gun oil and the particular musk of men who had been long in the saddle. The woman, she told them her name was Mary, moved carefully to the fire, where a pot of something that smelled of herbs and desperation simmered over the flames. She had been alone for 3 days, she explained, her husband having ridden to town for supplies that should have brought him back 2 days past. The storm had caught him, perhaps, or the journey had proved longer than expected. She did not speak of other possibilities, but they lived in the silence between her words, in the way her eyes searched their faces for judgment or mercy. Samuel watched her move around the cabin, noting the careful way she placed each step, the manner in which she pressed her hand to her back when she thought no one was looking. He had seen birthing before, had delivered calves and foals in his youth before the world had taught him that his hands were better suited to taking than giving. This woman was close, dangerously close, to bringing new life into a world that had already proven its capacity for cruelty. The outlaws settled into the cabin's corners, their weapons within easy reach, their eyes constantly moving between the windows and the door. They were men accustomed to being hunted, to reading the signs of approach and escape, but something in Mary's presence seemed to settle over them like a blanket, muffling the sharp edges of their constant vigilance. Dutch, whose hands had killed more men than he could count, found himself splitting wood for the fire. Martinez, who spoke only when necessary, began checking the cabin's supplies with the methodical care of someone who understood the mathematics of survival. Billy, still young enough to remember his mother's face, helped Mary to a chair when her pains began to come in waves. The storm arrived with the full darkness, driving snow against the windows with a sound like thrown sand. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the promise of death for any caught in the open. The men had chosen their shelter well, but as the hours passed and Mary's condition worsened, the cabin began to feel less like sanctuary and more like a trap. Her labor began in earnest near midnight, with contractions that left her gasping and clutching at the rough wooden table. Samuel found himself holding her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm, while the other men paced the cabin like caged animals. They were killers and thieves, men who had turned their backs on civilized society, but faced with the raw reality of birth and the possibility of death, they found themselves stripped of their hard-won indifference. "The baby's coming wrong," Mary whispered, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." Samuel had seen enough difficult births on the ranches of his youth to recognize the signs. The baby was breached, positioned in such a way that birth would be difficult, if not impossible, without help. Mary needed a doctor, needed skilled hands and medical knowledge that none of them possessed. But the storm raged outside with the fury of winter's judgment, and the nearest town was 20 miles through conditions that would kill man and horse alike. "We need to get her to town," Billy said, his young voice tight with concern. "She needs help." "In this storm?" Dutch's voice carried the weight of hard experience. "We'd never make it. The horses would founder in the drifts, and we'd all freeze before we covered half the distance." Thomas, who had been silent since their arrival, finally spoke. "Her husband might be trying to get back. Could be he's holed up somewhere, waiting for the storm to pass." But Samuel could see in Mary's eyes that she no longer believed her husband would return. Whether death or cowardice had claimed him, the result was the same. She faced her ordeal alone, with only 5 outlaws for company. Men who had chosen to live outside the law, who had traded their souls for freedom and found themselves bound by chains of their own making. As the night deepened and the storm intensified, Mary's condition worsened. Her contractions came closer together, each one racking her small frame with pain that left her gasping and crying out. The men took turns holding her hands, offering what comfort they could. But they all knew they were witnessing something beyond their power to control or comprehend. Samuel found himself thinking of the women he had known. His mother, dead these 15 years. A girl named Sarah who had waited for him to return from the war that had changed him into something she could no longer recognize. The widows and working women who had shared his bed in the years since, each one a reminder of the gentleness he had lost. Now faced with Mary's suffering, he felt the weight of his accumulated failures pressing down upon him like the snow that gathered on the cabin's roof. The baby came at dawn, as the storm reached its peak and the world outside disappeared into a white void. Samuel and Dutch worked together, their hands guided by instinct and desperation, while Mary screamed with a pain that seemed to tear at the very fabric of existence. The child emerged blue and still, its tiny form lifeless in Samuel's trembling hands. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for the wind's howl and Mary's labored breathing. Then Dutch, his face grim with concentration, began working over the infant, rubbing its back, clearing its airways, breathing life into lungs that had never known air. Samuel watched, his own breath held, as the older man fought death with the same intensity he had once brought to killing. The baby's first cry was thin and weak, but it was life calling out against the darkness. Mary wept with relief and exhaustion, her arms reaching for the child that Samuel placed gently against her. The men stood around them in a circle, their faces soft with an emotion they had forgotten they possessed. But Mary's ordeal was far from over. She had lost too much blood, her body too weakened by the difficult birth and the days of solitude that had preceded it. As the morning light filtered through the snow-covered windows, Samuel could see the gray pallor creeping into her face, the way her breathing had become shallow and labored. "I'm not going to make it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "The baby, please." The words hung in the air like a judgment, like a test of character that none of them had expected to face. They were outlaws, men who had chosen to live outside the bonds of society and responsibility. They owed this woman nothing, had no obligation to her or her child beyond the temporary shelter they had all shared. The storm would pass, the law would come, and they would ride on to whatever fate awaited them. But as Samuel looked down at Mary and the infant she held, he felt something shift inside him, a recognition of what he had become and what he might yet choose to be. The baby was innocent, untouched by the violence and cruelty that had shaped their lives. In its small, perfect form lay the possibility of redemption, the chance to save something pure from the chaos they had helped to create. "We'll get you to town," he said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "Soon as the storm breaks, we'll get you both to safety." Mary's eyes met his, and in them he saw something he had not expected: trust. Despite everything, despite the guns they wore and the hardness they carried, she believed in their promise. The weight of that belief settled on his shoulders like a mantle, heavy with responsibility and the possibility of grace. The storm raged for 2 more days, holding them all prisoner in the cabin's warmth while the world outside disappeared beneath layers of snow and ice. During that time, the 5 outlaws became something they had never been before: protectors, guardians of life rather than dealers in death. They took turns caring for Mary and the baby, melting snow for water, keeping the fire burning, sharing their food, and offering what comfort they could. Dutch, whose hands had known only violence for so long, proved surprisingly gentle with the infant. He could make the baby stop crying with a soft humming that seemed to rise from some deep place in his chest, a melody that spoke of lullabies half remembered from his own childhood. Martinez, the quiet one, spent hours whittling small toys from scraps of wood, his knife creating birds and horses with careful precision. Billy, the youngest of their group, appointed himself Mary's guardian, sitting beside her bed and reading aloud from a book of poetry he had carried in his saddlebags. His voice, still unbroken by the weight of too many sins, filled the cabin with words of beauty and hope that seemed to push back against the darkness, pressing in from outside. Thomas, who had been silent for so long that his companion sometimes forgot he could speak, began to tell stories, tales of his childhood, of the family he had lost, of the dreams he had carried before the world had taught him that dreams were luxuries he could not afford. His words wove a tapestry of memory and longing that held them all in its embrace. And Samuel found himself changed by the experience, his hard edges softened by the sight of new life and the trust in Mary's eyes. He had been running for so long, driven by anger and desperation and the need to stay ahead of the consequences of his choices. But here, in this small cabin with this woman and her child, he found something he had thought lost forever: the possibility of redemption. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, it revealed a world transformed. Snow lay thick on the ground, sculpting the landscape into new forms that sparkled in the morning sun. The men prepared to leave, loading their horses with supplies and making ready for the journey to town. But they would not be traveling alone. They had fashioned a travois from wood and blankets, a makeshift stretcher that could be pulled behind one of the horses. Mary, still weak but determined, would ride upon it with her baby, while the men formed a protective circle around them. It would be a difficult journey, dangerous and slow, but they would make it together or not at all. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Mary pressed something into Samuel's hand, a small wooden cross, carved with simple skill and worn smooth by handling. "My husband made this," she said, her voice steady despite her weakness. He would have wanted you to have it. Samuel closed his fingers around the cross, feeling its weight in the warmth of her touch. It was a gift beyond price, a symbol of faith and forgiveness that he did not deserve, but would treasure nonetheless. In that moment, he understood that their encounter had changed him irrevocably, that the man who rode away from this place would not be the same one who had arrived seeking shelter from the storm. The journey to town took most of the day, their progress slow through the deep snow. The men took turns breaking trail, their horses laboring through drifts that sometimes reached their bellies. Mary endured the rough ride with quiet courage, her baby wrapped warm against her chest, her eyes fixed on the horizon where safety waited. They reached the town as the sun was setting, their small procession drawing stares from the few people brave enough to venture out in the aftermath of the storm. The doctor, a gruff man with gentle hands, took charge of Mary and the baby, pronouncing them both likely to recover with proper care. The outlaws waited outside his office, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of responsibility discharged, of trust honored. As night fell over the town, the 5 men gathered in the shadows between buildings, their horses restless beneath them. They had kept their word, had delivered Mary and her child to safety, but now the familiar urgency of flight pressed upon them. The law would come, as it always did, and they needed to be gone before it arrived. But as they prepared to ride out, Samuel found himself looking back at the doctor's office, where warm light spilled from the windows and Mary rested with her child. He thought of the cross she had given him, now tucked safely in his shirt pocket, and of the trust she had placed in men who had no right to it. "We could stay," Billy said quietly, his young voice carrying a weight of longing. "Maybe it's time to stop running." The others looked at him, then at each other, each man wrestling with the same temptation. They had tasted something different in that cabin, had glimpsed the possibility of being more than what they had become. But the past was a chain that bound them, and the future held only the promise of more running, more hiding, more of the bitter existence they had chosen. "No," Samuel said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "We are what we are. Can't change that now." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not entirely true. Something had changed in that cabin, in the 3 days they had spent protecting life instead of taking it. The baby's first cry had awakened something in all of them, a recognition of what they had lost and what they might yet hope to reclaim. They rode out of town in the darkness, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. Behind them, the lights of the settlement faded into the distance, but the warmth of what they had shared remained. They had done something good, something right, and that knowledge would travel with them wherever the trail might lead. Samuel reached into his pocket and touched the wooden cross, feeling its smooth surface against his fingers. It was a small thing, a simple gift from a woman who had no reason to trust them and every reason to fear them. But in its weight, he felt the possibility of redemption, the chance that even men like them might find their way back to grace. The night was cold and clear, the stars bright overhead, and the trail stretched out before them like a ribbon of possibility. They were still outlaws, still men outside the law, but they carried something new within them, the knowledge that they had chosen mercy over violence, protection over predation, hope over despair. As they rode through the darkness, Samuel found himself thinking of the baby's cry, of Mary's trust, of the moment when Dutch had breathed life into lungs that had never known air. They had all been present at a miracle, had all played their part in bringing new life into the world. Whatever sins they had committed, whatever darkness they had embraced, they had also been instruments of grace. The trail ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and choices yet to be made. But for the first time in years, Samuel felt something other than the weight of his failures pressing down upon him. He felt the possibility of redemption, the chance that even the hardest hearts might be softened by the sight of innocence and the trust of those who had no reason to believe in their goodness. The 5 outlaws rode on through the night, their horses' breath forming clouds in the cold air, their faces set toward whatever future awaited them. They had kept their word, had honored the trust placed in them, and in doing so had discovered something they had thought lost forever, the possibility of being more than what they had become. Behind them, in the warm safety of the doctor's office, Mary held her baby close, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the 5 men who had risked everything to save them both. She did not know their names, did not know their stories, but she knew their hearts, knew that beneath the hardness and the violence, they had chosen to be heroes when heroism was needed most. The cross Samuel carried was a symbol of that choice, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the hearts of the most hardened men, the possibility of grace remained. It was a small thing, a simple gift, but it carried within it the weight of transformation and the promise of redemption for those brave enough to seek it. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.